All right. Yeah, so my name is Wiston Rodriguez. By training, I am an industrial organizational psychologist, an occupational health psychologist. And so really integrating psychological principles to solve different workplace stressors or understand the impact of workplace stressors at work. And so really this project is really is rooted in the workplace mistreatment literature. So specifically in workplace incivility. And so incivility is a form of workplace mistreatment that is defined by three characteristics. One of them being that it violates a shared norms for mutual respect at work. It's also very ambiguous in the intent to harm, and it's also low in its intensity. So for example, this may manifest as ignoring someone at work when they're speaking, or speaking to a colleague in a condescending tone. And so really workplace incivility can come from a variety of sources and can also be instigated, experienced, and or witnessed. And really where this literature has evolved is that into this like theory of selective incivility, which has really been dubbed the modern form of discrimination because it is illegal to overtly discriminate against someone in the workplace. And so selective incivility has these same characteristics as incivility, but it's directed, or the mistreatment is directed towards someone because of their identity or identities. So in other words, you are mistreating them because they belong to a marginalized group. And so what we knew so far before this study was that racial minorities and women are more likely to experience selective incivility, and women of color experience more of this double jeopardy, which really raised this question around what about other identities such as LGBTQ plus employees, and how might that, can this theory be applied to this group? And so really this project was guided by three research questions. One of them being, why do LGBTQ plus employees experience more selective incivility than their cisgender and heterosexual counterparts? The second question is, how do these experiences then impact these employees? And then lastly, what factors might help these employees cope with selective incivility experiences? And so this study was the overall methodology for this study. There were two studies that make up this project. So before diving into these research questions that I just discussed, I wanted to establish that selective incivility is actually something that is occurring for this group. And so that was really the goal of study one. It was to examine the rate of selective incivility by comparing LGBTQ plus and a LGBTQ plus sample to a cisgender heterosexual sample. And then the goal of study two was to investigate those predictors, outcomes of selective incivility, as well as their underlying mechanisms and boundary conditions using an LGBTQ plus sample only. And so with the study one methodology, you'll see that there was a total of 876 participants, split even there between the two groups. And in this study, I only measured their experiences of workplace incivility at work. It should also be noted that all participants for all studies were recruited via Academic Prolific. And then the results for this study suggest that there is actually a significant difference between these groups in that we found in running an independent samples t-test. The results suggest that LGBTQ plus employees do in fact experience more workplace incivility when compared to their cisgender heterosexual counterparts. And so in this study, once we kind of established that this was a phenomenon for this group, we wanted to move on to study two. Sorry, I'm having some trouble with the control here. All right, there we go. So for study two, the methodology, the goal was to get at least 900 or recruit 914 participants to obtain a minimum sample size of 220. And this study was done with 4 waves of data collection with a 1-month lag in between. And then those that participated in study one were excluded from study 2, and participants were compensated across each wave, and they could earn up to $18.30. Here's a visual of the procedure for this study. So you'll see in each of these boxes the different time points and the different measures that were collected at each time point, as well as the attrition rates for each time point as well. And then I'll break this down. I'll show you a visual of the proposed research model for this study here. It is very comprehensive, and so if there's anything that's unclear, please feel free to bring that up during the Q&A, but I will break this down in the next coming slides. And so specifically, I identified degree of disclosure as a potential predictor of selective incivility. And degree of disclosure just means the extent to which someone discloses their LGBTQ plus identity. And this consists of two behaviors, one of them being revealing behaviors, that you reveal your identity. However, in this study, we found that there was no significant relationship between revealing behaviors and selective incivility, which are the results reported on the top. And then the second type of behavior are concealing behaviors, which mean that you hide your identity. And so what's interesting is that in this study, I found that there was actually a positive relationship between concealing your identity and selective incivility experiences, which was contrary to prediction because, if you're concealing your identity, I hypothesized that you wouldn't have really experienced any mistreatment. And so that was an interesting finding. And in addition to identifying predictors, I was interested in identifying health and well-being outcomes that impact not only employees, but also impact organizations. So I identified alcohol use, burnout, and job satisfaction as outcomes. And as you'll see here on the slides, there was a positive relationship between selective incivility and alcohol use and burnout, but there was no significant relationship between selective incivility and job satisfaction. I was also interested in identifying the underlying mechanisms on the relationship between selective incivility and health and well-being outcomes. And so I used sociometer theory as a theoretical framework to identify these mediators. And sociometer theory suggests that us as human beings, we basically scan our environment for indicators that signal relational value or relational devaluation, right? So we look for clues to see like how worthy others perceive us to be. And so specifically, I identified organizational-based self-esteem and self-blame attributions as potential mediators. And as you'll see, and just for clarification, organizational-based self-esteem is just one's self-esteem in terms of who they are as an employee and part of that particular organization. And as you'll see here on the screen, there was no significant relationship between selective incivility and outcomes via that organizational-based self-esteem link. However, when looking at the self-blame attributions link, there was an indirect effect between selective incivility and burnout, as well as job satisfaction, but there was no significant relationship on alcohol consumption. And then lastly, I wanted to identify like what factors might mitigate the impact of selective incivility. And I identified perceived allyship behaviors at work and diversity and inclusion climate as potential moderators. However, as you'll see here on the screen, there was found no support for these hypotheses. So perceived allyship did not buffer the effects of selective incivility on subsequent outcomes. And a similar pattern was also found with diversity and inclusion climate as well. And so while the results for this are a bit mixed, right, and that we didn't find support for everything, I think that there still is some value from the study that came about. One of those being that the findings would suggest that we can apply the theory of selective incivility to LGBTQ plus employees, which in the past, or I guess this aligns with past work, but more so qualitative research suggesting that this is something that can be applied to this population. However, the results also do suggest that that relationship between disclosure and selective incivility, as well as outcomes, may be more nuanced than we previously thought. And so that just requires a little more research in the field to better understand like how these experiences might impact health and well-being outcomes. And then third, we do see that with that self-blame attribution link, that we do provide some partial support for sociometer theory, suggesting that selective incivility may be a experience that signals relational devaluation and can impact subsequent outcomes. And then lastly, what was interesting is that, I didn't find any support for perceived allyship in climate as a potential moderator, suggesting that these supportive behaviors may not always buffer against stressful experiences, as we see in the literature. And then lastly, I just want to say thank you to the Pilot Project's research training program for allowing me to conduct this study. It's really been monumental in helping me develop my own research program, and a huge thank you to my dissertation committee as well.